Hello, welcome to Key News. I'm Jim Lesko, your host for the day. Today we have in the studio with us a local resident from Northampton, Sonya Fierst. Sonya has recently come back from 2-year study in the country of Colombia and has some big stories to tell that I think will be very informative. Sonya, welcome. And tell me, how did you come about getting all the way to Colombia? I know that you left Northampton area to go out to California to school.
Yeah, I was studying outside of LA at Pitzer College, and it was my senior year in college, and I decided to apply for some type of international fellowship. And at the time, Pitzer's known for its Fulbrights. They send a ton of kids on Fulbright scholarships. And I applied for a Fulbright. I applied for something called a Watson. And one of my advisors who worked in the study abroad office pulled me aside one day and said, "Sonya, you got to check out the Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship." And I was like, I don't even know what that is. And I looked into it, and it just felt like a great fit. The Rotary Club sponsors 1 year of fully funded academic study in another country. But beyond just academics, the idea is to go as an ambassador. And to, literally, the mission is to promote peace and goodwill throughout the world to neighboring countries, or to different countries.
So, well, I'm very excited to hear that, because I know that we support the Amherst Rotary also auction here in our studios, that they donate money towards the national office also, which goes to those kind of programs. I know they also give scholarships in the local area too. But how'd you pick Colombia? How did it come about going there?
Well, you know, the way that the Rotary Scholarship works is you apply to 5 countries, and then you go through a series of interviews and application process, lots of paperwork to fill out, and eventually, if you get the scholarship, they assign you to one of the 5 that you applied to. Colombia was it was actually my top choice. I knew I wanted to go to a Spanish-speaking country, and I'd like to be in Latin America. I've always felt drawn to Colombia. When in high school, I lived in Germany for a year, and my best friend was from Colombia, from Cali, and she taught me how to salsa dance, and she would always talk about the culture and language and history, and I just didn't know anything about it. It's not really a country that we are exposed to other than through the stereotypes of, you know, drug smuggling and violence and guerrilla warfare. And so it also, I thought, was a really interesting, the location of it, where it falls in the Americas, and it's very diverse geographically, culturally, and yeah.
So I think, you know, it's interesting. You go to Germany and you meet someone from Colombia who then gets you really interested in their country. So it's a roundabout. It's quite an interesting way to get there. When you first arrived, I mean, when I've been in foreign countries in language, in this case, you had some mastery of, and I'm sure it got better while you were there. But just to start breaking in, but you're in an academic setting that your courses were all in Spanish, I'm assuming. Right? What was that like for you?
It was hard. I mean, I arrived in Medellin, which is where I spent the 2 years. I didn't know a single person in Colombia, and I had like sort of created a fantasy in my head of what it would be like to get there and just immediately start like salsa dancing and have a group of friends, and everything would be easy, and it was like it rained every day for 6 months. I knew Spanish. I never took it in college, but I had worked in lots of restaurants with Spanish speakers, and I did a lot of work with the Mexican community in LA, but I had never used it at like an academic level like that. And just this, you know, little thing, opening a bank account took me 4 hours sitting there. It was so frustrating, and I just didn't know any of the technical terms that they were asking me for. Trying to find a place to live in the beginning, just figuring out the bus schedule, public transportation, or getting through the bureaucracy of my university to kind of figure out when classes even started. I remember it was just like, when does class start? It seemed like every program had a different start date, and it was like I'd talk to some person, and then they would send me off to somebody else, and then I'd get there at 11:45, and it was like everyone's on lunch break already for 2 hours until 2, and so I had to sit around until 2, and then I'd come back, and the person who I'd spoke to earlier was no longer in their office. It was like, these are just sort of, in the beginning, they hit me hard because it was the cultural differences. But over time, I learned to kind of adapt and love certain aspects of that about Colombia.
Usually there's some moment, aha moment, where it's an individual or a situation where all of a sudden you go, okay, I now feel comfortable. I feel a little bit more. Was there a moment that you can point to, or a couple of different times that you said, like, yeah?
You know, not one shines through in my head of like this day that it just clicked. It was just sort of a longer process. But I think there came a point when I stopped trying to sort of like muscle my way through it all and just kind of like stopped and was like, okay, this is the way things work here. It's a different culture, it's a different country. I have to realign my expectations about what it is that, how I think things should be done, and just sort of breathe and let things flow. And that was a big, just coming to that realization helped me a lot.
So getting into the rhythm of those around you versus bringing your own ideas.
Yeah, and it takes a while, because even in my head before going, I thought that was my plan all along. Like, I'm not gonna have any preconceived notions. I'm just gonna come in and adapt. But then you get there and you're like stopped in your tracks by your own way of thinking and how you want things to be done. And I remember being frustrated a lot in the beginning, and just like to the point of tears, and like, I just like, why isn't this working the way I want it to?
So let me ask you, as part of the ambassadorship, I mean, let's go the academic side first, and then I know that you did a lot of traveling within the country and met a lot of people.
Yeah.
What were your sociology major in college?
I was in international intercultural studies.
I apologize.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what does that entail?
It's a really interdisciplinary. Sounds interdisciplinary. It's basically a combination of sociology, politics, international relations, anthropology. It's just a mix of lots of different classes, and
a very liberal arts approach.
Totally liberal arts approach, yeah.
Which is great.
And I loved it. It was Pitzer, and it felt like just the right thing for me to study. I could kind of create and choose my own coursework, and so it was.
So given all of that, what you just said, then a country like Colombia truly fits into on a major scale, on an international way. So what was some of the studying that you did, or was there any one particular line of studying you did while there?
Well, so I started out, the scholarship, the Rotary funds 1 year of study. And so when I got to Colombia, I was sent to a school called EAFIT, which is one of the top business schools definitely in the country, and probably the top in Medellin. It's a private school, and they do a lot of international business, international relations. And I chose to do a program called Geopolitics. And it was a year-long program that's called especialización in Spanish. I still don't know how to translate it. We would literally translate it to a specialization track, but in Colombia and other parts of Latin America, it's a degree you get between undergrad and a master's. And so I did a year of that in geopolitics. And at the end of that first year, when my scholarship officially ended, I thought, well, I'm not quite ready to come back yet to the States. Like, this has been so nice. And at that point, I had gotten a job. I had a really great group of friends. I had a boyfriend. I was sort of like into the rhythm of life. And I didn't want to come back to the States, but I also thought this degree, as great and useful as it is in Colombia, nobody in the United States really recognizes a specialization degree. We don't have that in our academic system. So I looked around at different schools in Medellin, and at this point I transferred. One other university, another top private university, said that they would accept all of my year-long credits of the specialization to their master's program, and then I would only do one other year in the master's. So I ended up studying political studies the whole time.
So your second year, were you still working on research too, or at that point were you becoming truly an ambassador outside of the academic realm too?
Say a little bit of both. Really, my research started in the second year. That's when I had to start to pick a thesis topic, and that's when I kind of veered away started to create my own path and what I wanted to study. And I went into this direction of public policy and sort of was analyzing something called participatory budgeting that was implemented in one of the more controversial neighborhoods of Medellin.
Could you just explain what that is? I think I might have an idea what that is, but it'd be interesting from the viewpoint.
Absolutely. Participatory budgeting, it's a form of participatory democracy that was formed in 1889 in Brazil, in Porto Alegre. And basically at the time there was such great inequality, like much of Latin America, between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, and a lot of people were being marginalized from the decision-making process. And so the government decided to give a certain percentage of the public funds to ordinary people to decide how to allocate these resources and spend on what they want through a series of municipal meetings and neighborhood meetings. And basically people would just come together and they could decide, how are we going to spend this public budget? that was then exported around Brazil, around Latin America, eventually went to Europe, and it's now coming to the United States as sort of a tool in participatory democracy. So what I was looking at specifically was one neighborhood in Medellin, which is really notorious for drug conflict. A lot of trafficking goes through there. It's poor. There's been a lot of violence historically. Large Afro-Colombian migrant communities from within, so domestic migrants that have come from other regions of Colombia have landed there, and they've been really cut out in a lot of ways from any of the decision-making that's gone on. So participatory budgeting in 2004 has gone in to different places around the city and allowed people to kind of come in and through being elected as delegates. I still haven't figured out how to like talk about this in a concise way.
There's a process, obviously.
And so I looked at how young people, how youth are being involved in participatory budgeting, because there's a lot of youth groups that come from this neighborhood. They do a lot of hip hop, a lot of music, and I wanted to find the intersection of kind of like institutional and non-institutional forms of participation.
And how did you find anything that was obvious or less obvious to them that was happening, or potential? You know what I mean? Kind of curious, because I think the United States has the same, we have many of those issues of our inner cities.
Absolutely.
Of asking people coming and saying, we're going to put a highway through the middle of your, isn't that great, people? And it's like,
like, do they even ask for this? Do they want
Did they ask? No, they just want the property through eminent domain. It's happened in the past. So this form is very, it's not a town meeting concept of town-wide, it's very specific to neighborhood.
Right, exactly.
And so how did the youth, how were they getting the youth to become more involved?
Well, it's an interesting question. The way that a lot of youth get involved is that they, for instance, in the case of Comuna 13, which is the neighborhood I focused on, there's a huge hip-hop presence there. And so a lot of youth wanted to put on these festivals, music festivals. They wanted to have shows, and so they would use participatory budgeting to get the funds to set up hip-hop schools and festivals. And so that was really interesting. They would kind of they learned to work the system in a way that they could sort of like finance their own interests and initiatives.
Seed money to get something
exactly, which then created a lot of controversy with other people in the community, which is like, hey, we don't really necessarily need a hip-hop school. What we need is like roads to be built and bridges, you know, school. So what I found, I did a lot of interviews, in-depth interviews with people in the, you know, government officials at the mayor's office down to local people in the community. And it was so interesting. It was hard to be a gringa going into these places and trying to talk about things. I mean, it's just, I'm a foreigner and there's limitations of what I can access and do, and I had to be really sensitive about the ways that I entered these communities. But it was, for me, fascinating to get a broad spectrum of how people view this initiative. And from the mayor's office, they promote it as like democracy, participation, everyone's involved, it's great. And there's elements of that, especially, at least in the idea of it. And you go to the community and a lot of people are like, listen, we're not actually, nothing's changing. You know, like, we're not really getting a voice here. The same local power holders in the community are the ones who really make the decisions, and we haven't been able to access this because of the way that it's set up, who gets elected to be delegates. Also, the neighborhoods, this neighborhood is very dangerous. There's something called invisible boundaries. So you have these gang lords, basically guerrilla groups or paramilitaries, that kind of run sections of the neighborhood, and you can't cross these boundaries. So if you live in one part high in the mountains, and the meetings are being held down in a different neighborhood, you might literally just not be able to cross into that neighborhood. And young people are often caught in the intersection of this.
There's a lot of visible and non-visible boundaries that exist
Absolutely.
within every neighborhood, wherever you are in whatever country. I would assume then what I'm picking up somewhat from you too is like, its structure is there, but then it's a question of how people get within that structure. So if in the United States, there was still a program called Community Development Block Grants out of the Housing Urban Development that required local advisory groups to be made of citizens to decide how the money was going to be used in the catchment areas, okay, the high poverty area. But a lot of times, certain people were picked that became kind of more of the voice of the general. The neighborhood really doesn't know what's in their best interest. Therefore, we need you to help us to get the slum clearance or this to happen or that. So, I mean, it truly, if it's going to be from the roots up, the grassroots up, then a local government has to say, even if we don't agree with it, it's coming from your, well, let's work with you the best way we can. And so was there that tension that existed?
Yeah, there's a lot of tension, because even if the government gives that power, decision-making power, to the community members, within the community there's so many different ideas of what should be done, what needs to be done, and how do you mediate these? How do you kind of come in and intervene as a government official, as a community organization, and decide whose projects should be funded and who's not? So there is a lot of controversy about this. It's also a young initiative. It started in 2004 in Medellin, and it's growing, developing each year.
So let me ask you, were you able to debrief with your findings? Were you able to share them with either those that you had interviewed or some people that are running the programs? And if you did, how did that go?
Yeah, well, actually, I just finished my thesis last week and turned it in.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank
That's
you. Yeah,
huge.
110 pages, and I'm so happy that it's over. But I just sent it down there, and it's actually, they asked me to publish it in an academic journal in Medellin, which is really, really exciting. And I absolutely plan on giving a copy to everybody who I talk to, and I'm so interested to know how they think it went. And I've been in touch with people in Medellin throughout the whole process, mentors and people who sort of are involved in the community level and also in the government level, and just kind of bouncing back and forth ideas. My advisors down in Colombia as well. It's, you know, I hope it'll be well received, and I hope that I was able to, the insights that I got were right on, and that, you know, I was able to pick up accurately kind of what's going on, but it's tough. So it'll be interesting to see how people react.
Well, you know, Massachusetts now has someone that we know in the Secretary of the State's office, you know, and obviously Latin America is coming back up more and more into the administration's viewpoint and need to serve and work collaboratively with. But as you said, it's starting to come back to the United States even as a form. Do you know of any specific cities that are trying to implement this?
Last March, there was the first ever participatory budgeting conference in New York City, and that was it was like North America, Canada, and the United States. And they had, I think it's been implemented in New York and somewhere in California, and I believe starting in Chicago. This was last year. And Toronto has some budding initiatives, but I'm not exactly sure what the state in the United States is, but that's something I plan on looking into, and
well, I would
I'm
love
really interested to find out.
Yeah, if you do and want to come back another time, and we can maybe even bring a couple more people in that are involved with that, because the process itself is just so interesting, you know, and potential. But we talk democracy in large D's and small D's, but the sharing of true power and decision making, whether it be at the state level or local level, is always fraught with a lot of tension and easy to stab wounds into and saying it works or doesn't work. So I'm always a believer in citizen participation, but not just for the sake of filling in the blank that so many people showed up to a meeting, or that they actually were heard and implemented, their suggestions was implemented. So there's, you know, there's form and then there's function.
I just want to say one quick thing about that. One of the sort of the crux of my thesis was that I don't think you can use participatory budgeting as a form to create democracy. You can't go into a community that has a history of corruption and lots of political problems and no decision-making participation, and just say, here's participatory budgeting, everybody come in and work, because there needs to be a basic kind of formation and civic engagement that goes on before that. But if some place already has that set up and has democratic values in place, then it can be a really effective tool, if that makes any sense.
No, it absolutely does. And I think, you know, as we're winding down here, the communication aspect is huge. And one of the problems I find in the United States right now is that the communication is yelling at each other and trying to drown each other out, as opposed to, and I'm talking about the big media as opposed to the community media. We do take a different approach, not only in access TV, but radio and local community media press. But you, as a recent graduate, I mean, there's a lot of youth energy in the United States and around the world right now, struggling to find jobs with the economy the way it is, and getting involved in these kind of issues that will possibly change function. you know, of governments if listened to and participatory. So are you any clearer of how you'd like to move forward with your life at this point? And I mean that, I love what you did. I was wondering, is that informing you now?
Right. Yeah, it's definitely the 2 years I spent in Colombia. And I hope that my academic pursuits also will somehow be involved in the direction I go professionally. I know I want to stay involved with Latin America in some way, with the Spanish-speaking world. And so I'm looking for jobs now. I came back last year, and I spent basically the last 6 months writing my thesis. And I taught a Spanish course at Hampshire College for their Jan term, which was really fun.
Didn't you tell me that most of the people were from other countries that were taking Spanish?
Yeah, there was like half the group was international students. It was really cool.
Yeah. So other countries are obviously taking multiple languages seriously.
Yes.
It'd be nice if the United States,
I know,
as
it would
a
be great if we could do that. Bilingual education. Oh,
so in our last minute together, any other opportunities, or where you think you'd like to kind of locate? Or
yeah, I'm looking. I want to stay in the Northeast. I want to be near my family after being so far for so long. New York, DC, maybe Miami. I'm looking at lots of different cities, but it's a process. You know, the job. I just started applying for jobs basically this month, and I'm realizing that it takes a lot longer than one would expect or would hope. And the idea is, I'm trying not to feel too anxious about it and just enjoy the process and do some soul searching about what it is that I really want to do, where I want to go. I'd like to work in development and Latin America, so we'll see. But it's nice to be back in the area and back at home in Northampton and Amherst, working here in Amherst.
Sonya, thank you. I wish you the best of luck, and thank you for agreeing to come in and sharing your experience.
Thank you.
And your travels, but I also love the research you did, and I really would hope that we can maybe continue with that and talk about the participation. Thank you for joining us, and remember to check us out online, amherstmedia.org.